Or if you're a fan of Pink Floyd, I think you're really going to enjoy this video. What I found is I found two different reviews that came out in 1973 after Dark Side of the Moon, and one of them really likes the album and one of them really doesn't like the album. And I thought you would enjoy listening to what these two people at that time had to say about Dark Side of the Moon right after it came out. And it's so interesting looking back on this stuff because we have the hindsight of now, 50 years later. And but this was, Pink Floyd, they were famous, but I mean, this is years before The Wall. I mean, they was just a different time. We so many of us that are my age, we became aware of Pink Floyd after they were legends. And so this was just kind of a different time. And so anyway, I think I'm going to read these two things to you. They're not very long, but I think you're going to enjoy them. And a lot of people, if you're like me, one of the first things that you were introduced to with Pink Floyd was this album. When I first got my first CD player, one of the first CDs I went out and bought was Dark Side of the Moon. And I remember just sitting in my room and I had these huge Klipsch speakers and I turned it up and it just blew me away. It was the sound, it was so powerful. The way they had produced this thing. Of course, it's produced by Alan Parsons. Anyway, I think you'll find this fascinating. So this first review is from March 17th, 1973 from the Grand Rapids Press, page 14. And this is the guy that actually likes the album. And it's called For What It's Worth with Don Ottenhoff. Okay, and here's his discussion about Dark Side of the Moon. Since the early days of the Moody Blues and the introduction of Moogs, Mellotrons, and the like, English rock groups have become involved with experiments in musical textures and unique sound experiences. While many of the attempts have succeeded in producing unusual sonic architecture, Pink Floyd seems to have gone beyond this, developing a sonic atmosphere, not simply the psychological atmosphere that might be experienced in a Gothic cathedral, but a palpable atmosphere. Pink Floyd's music oozes through the pores of the skin, is breathed as well as heard. Dark Side of the Moon is probably Pink Floyd's most successful integration of electronics and their particularly vaporous brand of rock. It is certainly, for the group, an important step beyond Echoes. Although it was a remarkable album, Echoes lacked the substance and control of electronics that is evident in Dark Side of the Moon. Echoes had a pleasant, almost narcotic lack of changes, and the electronic segment was more of a well-placed, well-performed interlude than an integral part of the piece. The material on Dark Side of the Moon, maintains a subtle sense of continuity, but like a similar successful effort after Bathing at Baxter's by Jefferson Airplane, the continuity is never achieved by forfeiting the variety of the material or sinking into a sophomoric repetition of themes. Now, this is really, I think this is a really important statement here when you start looking at this, and I'm just going to interject something for a second. Let's see. Never achieved by forfeiting the variety of material or sinking into sophomoric repetition of themes. When you listen to Dark Side of the Moon, it is, as he puts it there, it is a wide variety of sounds and presentations and so many different things that are done there. They don't forfeit that element that we have so much variety, so much difference in sound, so many different ups and downs. And anyway, so I think that's just kind of an important statement. On the instrumentals, on The Run, Any Color You Like, and on vocals like Money, Floyd displays their growing knowledge of and subsequent ease in handling electronic music. The record opens with a bit of electronic foreshadowing of music to come, which crescendos into one of the band's typically ozonic tunes, Breathless, which is such a great song. On the Run follows with some fine Moogery by Richard Wright. And what he's got to be talking about there is the Moog synthesizer. Wright's Moog work and Pink Floyd's use of electronics in general is common in rock, highly melodic, and usually confined to standard rock compositional settings. This is in contrast to Frank Zappa's electronic music, which is derived directly from atonalists like Edgar Varese and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. I'm not sure who either of those are, but there was a period of time, especially in the early 20th century, where there was a lot of atonal music being produced. And Frank Zappa dabbled in all of that stuff. While Pink Floyd is continually experimenting with electronics, it is always in relationship to what can easily be identified as rock. On Money, Pink Floyd brings the diverse elements of their music under complete control. It is perhaps the best piece of music Floyd has produced. Both Dick Perry's sax solo and Now, if you're looking at this on the screen, don't be thrown by what it says here, because it says David Gilman's. And so obviously an editor that went through this thing changed Gilmour to Gilman. So I'm going to read it correctly. And David Gilmour's guitar solo are exemplary of the economy and efficiency, totally lacking in much rock soloing, which can be attained in creative rock solos. Gilmour's solo has the aid of metrical propulsion from a slick time shift from 7 to 4. It's good to see rock bands playing in something other than 3 or 4 or the occasional 5. Now, just so you understand, and maybe a lot of you do already, the song Money, although it is that kind of a blues riff, it's in 7 time. So in other words, most rock music is 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4. It's like that. And you got kick, snare, kick, snare. That's how most rock music is put together. Well, what they did in Money, if you hadn't noticed, and if you listen to it, you'll notice that it kind of feels, I don't know what the word is, but it feels a little bit awkward in those first, maybe that's the best word to use because it's different than the normal 4/4. When you count it out, dun 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 dun, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. And so that's what he's talking about here, that they're experimenting with a really unusual time signature. And when was the last time there was a hit song that was in 7? This was like maybe one of, if not the only, one of the only times you'll ever find that kind of a thing in a rock song. Now, what he's talking about going into 4 is when David Gilmour starts in his solo, it actually changes and you can feel it. And it's so interesting what they do with that, because even while the song's kind of plotting and doing this thing that feels a little bit like a wagon wheel that has a little bump in it, it's so cool, the 7. But you feel, so it gives it just a little bit of tension, which is great when it jumps into the 4 on the solo, because then when Gilmour hits on that solo, that is what launches it. Because you have this thing that has this little bit of tension with that 7, and then it hits that 4, and it's like gung gung, and it goes into 4. And anyway, that's what he's talking about here. If you didn't know, and big Pink Floyd fans would probably already understand all that, but I wanted to just make sure you kind of knew what he was referring to here. Okay, so throughout the album, Gilmour shows himself to be both an able and apparently humble guitarist. Even when he is granted the room to solo, he never seems to flaunt his talent. And by the way, one of the reasons I think David Gilmour may be, if not the greatest guitarist, one of the greatest, is because of that. Every single note he ever plays is important. I absolutely love Gilmour's playing for that reason. Even, let's see here. His soloing, unlike that of Hendrix or Clapton, who often, with the best of results, quickly abandon the structure of the song in their extended improvisations, is always a logical extension of the song. For those who have felt discouraged or genuinely disgusted by the boundless mediocrity of recent rock, Dark Side of the Moon should provide some encouragement. If they could do something about their flaccid lyrics, Pink Floyd might be a near ideal rock band. Okay, now this is the not so good review. And it'd be interesting to listen to your feedback on what you think about this, what this guy has to say about it. Okay, so this is from the Gazette, Saturday, March 10th, 1973, page 49. And the title of this article is Pink Floyd's bid for top sound fails. This is by Bill Mann of the Gazette. Okay, Pink Floyd, the band that comes to town to play to a sold-out Forum Monday night, has never made it really big. The band is about to, but Floyd has never had an album in the top 10 in Billboard. Their records sell well here and in England, but they've yet to capture the US market. And perhaps that's the thing to remember when one listens to their just released album, Dark Side of the Moon. In the past, Pink Floyd have always had a somewhat restricted audience consisting largely, to not mince words, of hardcore heads. The band is probably the last major act going to specialize in what is basically psychedelic music. Their Echoes, which they'll probably play here, has been called the masterpiece of the acid idiom, and I can't disagree. Their previous album also was in that idiom, with the band going through subtle changes, adding droning noises to their always fluid and floating sound. Pink Floyd was always interesting, always melodious. And then it goes on to this idea of big market, has this subhead, until this new album. It's the band's biggest disappointment artistically yet. And I'm skeptical enough to believe that the reason is simple. Pink Floyd's trying to get in on the big market to sell more records to more people. Why this cynicism? Because Pink Floyd on several tracks of this album now sounds exactly like the Moody Blues. And how can you get bigger than that? After all, everything the Moodies do go to number one. That really, I'll be honest with you, when I first read this, that really surprised me. I have a whole bunch of Moody Blues stuff. As a matter of fact, I had a friend back in Denver that just like, it seemed like that's all he ever listened to was the Moody Blues. And don't get me wrong, I love Justin Hayward, Mike Pinder. I actually met Mike Pinder. He was one of the guys that really put the Mellotron into mainstream use. And they had a lot of great music. But I never, and maybe I should have, but I never made that connection. And again, for me, like a lot of people, this was all this stuff when I was a kid. I didn't discover these things until I was a teenager. And so maybe people back then were making these connections that later on in life, as I'm discovering things at different times, it wasn't so obvious to me. But I never made the Moody Blues Pink Floyd connection. And perhaps I should have. Anyway, if you have any thoughts about that, I'd love to get your feedback. Put that down in the comments. Pink Floyd, Moody Blues. So, okay. And Moody Blues were enormous. I mean, it's funny today because Pink Floyd continues to be huge that the Moody Blues are kind of forgotten. I mean, I think Mike Pinder died a couple of years ago and we just don't hear about them anymore. And yet, so they kind of disappeared, even though they were huge enough to be playing stadiums and things back in the day. Today, they don't, you just don't hear about them so much. All right. Us and Them is the best example here of the bloated, overproduced sound the Moodies made famous. Pink Floyd must have laid down 64 tracks on this cut, using about as many Mellotrons. But a couple of the cuts are passable, mainly because of Roger Waters' characteristically relaxed singing. On the Run is the album's best. So, and it's funny to hear him say Roger Waters' characteristically relaxed setting. And I wonder if he actually really means to say that. Because Roger Waters is not as, in my opinion, as characteristically relaxed as David Gilmour. David Gilmour is the one that like feels like energy drops when you listen to him. It feels good. He's got that pure voice. Where Roger Waters, he's the one that cackles a little bit more. I mean, he literally does that in some songs. And so anyway, I wonder if he meant to say that. So instead of the flowing, mellow Pink Floyd, here we get the Moodies, a boogie, money, and a mediocre sound collage on the Run. On The Great Gig in the Sky, the group once again overproduces a basically simple piece, with Doris Troy wailing purposelessly at the end. Miss Troy, you may recall, sang the soulful hit Just One Look a while back and will be here Monday night. Doris, who also worked on Let It Bleed with the Stones, should stick to rhythm and blues. If Pink Floyd plays many cuts from this album Monday, they're going to disappoint a lot of faithful fans. But just see if this isn't their biggest selling album yet. Okay, and then it says hot notes. Little known fact, The Norman Smith who produced most of Pink Floyd's earlier stuff is the same Hurricane Smith who had a #1 hit last month in the US, a moderate hit here. Oh Babe, What Would You Say? Pink Floyd says Capitol's John Small carries 22 roadies and their elaborate stage show takes 11 hours to set up. The band, which plays Toronto tomorrow, uses dry ice by the ton, and rumor has it will hang bird cages over the stage. Those who saw their last Montreal show 16 months ago still talk about it. Okay, and then that's the kind of the end of the Pink Floyd part of the article. Anyway, so you have 2 reviews there. One that's not so good, and one that's not so good and one that's good about Dark Side of the Moon. And I'd really love to get your feedback on what you think about that album. Because for me, and I don't know, I think I talked about it in another video. I'm not sure if I talked about it in this one. I loved that album. This is one of those examples of an almost perfect album for listening to the whole thing. And it's kind of a lost art, as you know, that way back a million years ago, we would buy a record and you'd maybe even get together with some friends and you just put it on and just listen to it. Because these were intended to be a full art form, and they would take you through the whole journey of the music, and they'd put the songs in a specific order to take you on this journey, the ebb and the flow, the up and the down. And this is a great example of it, this album, Dark Side of the Moon. And so I'd really, for me though, when I was that young and I understood that, I also had just specific songs. Again, I'm just a preteen when I'm first being introduced to this stuff. And so there were the songs, the individual songs like Time, that really jumped out, and Us and Them, and just a lot of the things on there that were so spectacular. So what was your take? Because a lot of people that are listening, that watch these videos are around my age and I find in many cases had very similar experiences that I did. And I'd love to hear your feedback on that. What your perception of this album was the first time you heard it. And did you get it? Like you listen to that whole album and you go, man, I get it. Or was it like me the first time I heard it, where I was really focused in on specific songs? Anyway, I'd love to get your feedback. Please follow the channel, like the video, give us your feedback on these things, and as always, have yourself a fantastic day.